person to be a part of this process. So kind of quick housekeeping, bathrooms are in the back. And then we have water fountains in the back. We have snacks also in the back of the room as well as coffee. This meeting is going to be recorded, especially this public record. So just, be on your best behavior. And we're going to get started. So we are first going to start with introductions. We're going to start with OWRD in the room first, and then we're going to go to OWRD employees online. So actually, I'm going to start with Ivan. Go ahead.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming. Ivan Gall with the Water Resources Department out of our Salem office.
Hi, everybody. I'm Derek Boschman. I'm a hydrogeologist in the groundwater section in our Salem office.
All right, sure. I'm Justin Iverson. I manage the groundwater section out of Salem.
Travis Singhos, farmer irrigator.
Jim Campbell, farmer.
I'm the water master here.
What's the OWRD first?
Yeah.
So goes down. You got down, right?
Very on the next year.
Jerry Gronin, hydrogeologist for the resources department.
I'm Jason Street. I'm the region manager for water resources.
I'm Tim Seymour. I'm the assistant manager for the groundwater section.
Okay.
Yeah, Alexandria Scott, community engagement coordinator, focused up in this region, with Water Resources Department.
Okay, Laura, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, Laura Hart, water policy analyst with OWRD, just helping Kelly out today.
And then Annette.
Good afternoon. I'm Annette Lieba. I'm the Technical Services Division Administrator at the Water Resources Department.
Okay, thank you so much. So now what we're going to do is introduction, starting with RAC members. So I'm actually going to start one of the two on the end. Who wants to raise to start?
Let's start down here.
Yeah.
Nick Schott.
Tony Hackett, Steve Rickman, Louis Moll, Brandon McMullen, Harney County Planning Director.
Mark Owens.
Ken Benson. I'm Roger Shealy.
John Short.
Brianna O'Connor with the Harney FWC. Barb Howard.
And Steve Grasky.
Kristen Shelton, Harney County Commissioner.
We have more back here.
Any other RAC members back here? Okay. please go.
Travis.
Michael.
Ben McCann.
Yep. And then Lisa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Lisa Brown with Water Watch.
Did I miss anyone else? Anyone in the room or online? As far as RAC members.
Jennifer Payton, EcoSource Native Seed and Restoration.
Okay. All right, let's go ahead and get this started. This council process here. All right, so today before we get to this slide, when the topics that we're going to cover today, first we're going to just kind of go through all the ground rules, talk about what the RAC does, kind of give you the background of that information. Then we're going to do a summary of the groundwater study. And from there, I'm going to be talking about the kind of the rulemaking timeline, why we're doing certain things at certain dates. And then we're going to be talking about the scope of the rulemaking and what we plan on covering and accomplishing during that time. We have a lot of OWRD members here today. Going forward, starting at RAC 2, we're going to narrow down that group to about 7 people. So that's going to be me, Kelly Mines. We have Alexandria Scott. We're going to have Ivan Gall, Tim Seymour, Jerry Grobman. We're going to have Derek Boschman, and then Jason Spring, and as well as Dally. So those are going to be your OWRD members that are going to help shepherd you through this process. Starting your RAC number 2. Any questions on that? feel free to ask me the questions today. We're really trying to get everyone on the same page in terms of information, so feel free to ask me questions during the presentation. Okay, so what exactly is the purpose of the RAC? So a RAC represents parties that will be affected by the rules, that are more likely to be affected by the rules once adopted. So we have brought you all here today because we believe that you have some sort of stake once we adopt these rules. And so what we ask of you is to provide input on two different things. So by rule and traditionally, we ask you to provide input on the physical impact statement. And what that means is basically the bottom line. So how will these rules impact you physically, as well as what is the cost of compliance? Right? So when we require, for example, measuring and reporting, what is the cost of compliance for you to have to install flow measurement devices? And you will provide that input. And then traditionally, OWRD has used RACs to provide comment on draft rule language. And so how that works is that starting in RAC 2, we're providing you draft rule language. And that draft rule language, we're asking you to review and then come to the meeting and we'll go line by line and you will give us input. Like, I don't like this line right here. I think it should be changed to this or any other kind of input. And what OWRD does is then we take that input, we go back to our shop and then we say, okay, this is if this is good, we should change this, we agree with this. And so we have the final say of what goes in the rules, but we use you to better draft these rules to meet the goals. So that is the purpose of the RAC. Any questions?
Kelly,
Yes.
so go back to fiscal impact statement.
Sure.
I believe that what you're trying to do is meet the requirements of Oregon statutes about a fiscal impact statement on any new rule.
Correct.
I think that applies to how does it impact the water users, all the different classes, and the community as a whole. And what I heard you being more specific than that, and I hope as this gets done, that the department does a broad fiscal impact statement.
Yes, that's the intention. Yeah. Thank you.
Hey, Kelly, can I ask that when folks in the room, before you start talking, just introduce yourself by name? That'll make it easier for folks online to track the conversation in the room.
Yes, thanks for the reminder, Laura. Yeah, so if we can all just say our names before we talk, that way people online can hear you. Sorry, so we're on mute. Hey, Brandon, I saw you just, Brandon Haslick, if you saw you just joined, can you introduce yourself?
Afternoon, this is Brandon Haslick with Burns Pike Tribe.
Thank you, Brandon. Okay, so ground rules going for today and going forward. So you're here to express. Okay, all right, so ground rules. So you're here today to express your viewpoint. We're all going to have different viewpoints on the rules. So when you hear something, we hear an input that you might not disagree with. We ask you to be respectful. We are bringing you here to have a conversation with WRG. So if you hear something that you don't necessarily agree with, we ask you to be respectful to expressing an opinion. People online, we're going to ask you to remain muted while you're online. And if you have a question, we're going to use that raise hand feature. We're only going to tell 4:30. We're going to ask the RAC members just to raise hands and ask questions. And then from 4:30 to 5 for those public members, you may provide comment between 4:30 and 5. So again, I reiterate online, we're just asking RAC members to raise their hand if they have any comments. So that's kind of our ground rules. The operating guidelines, what we expect out of you versus what you can expect out of us. So we ask you to attend and participate in each meeting. If you cannot make one of those meetings, you can let me know 24 hours ahead of time and somebody can come into your place. That's totally fine. Just let me know. We're also asking for, again, to provide input and advice to help the department consider various perspectives. What you can expect from the department throughout this process is that we'll be facilitating the meetings. We're gonna be fostering collaboration, consensus building, and we're also gonna be drafting the final rules and getting those adopted. Okay, so agenda today, we're going through the from 2 to 2:15. We're gonna go through those introductions. But then I'm gonna pass it over to Ivan. He's gonna give you a summary on the groundwater study. And then we're gonna do a community conversation. Then we're actually, something changed. We're gonna be doing a rulemaking, kind of like from 2:35 to 3:05, we're gonna do our rulemaking. But then we're gonna have a break, and after that, we're going to do a scope rule, discuss the scope. Ken's gonna be doing that. And then we're gonna start that like suggested changes conversations that we'll be doing. As well as having questions, comments, and then from 4:30 to 5, we're doing the public comment period. All right, Ivan, that's gonna go ahead and provide a summary of the groundwater study.
With the next slide. So I guess this is kind of the fun part. I've got 4 slides here that are going to summarize about 5 to 7 years worth of technical work and data collection down here, as well as a look back at history. The figure on the left is going to be helpful, and we'll refer to a number of these different boundaries, if you will, over the upcoming months as we talk about these rules. You can see Harney County is outlined in the red there, kind of the rectangular shape. The hatchered area within the orange or yellow color area is the greater Harney Valley groundwater area of concern. That was our first boundary that we put into the last rule revision about 7 or 8 years ago, and largely encompassed the lowlands where most of the groundwater development has occurred over the years. The orange area itself is the study area boundary of the study that was just completed with our agency in the U.S. Geological Survey. And then that black outline, which goes up to the northern end, up into Grand County there, and all the way to the south end of Harney County and the state line there, is our administrative basin boundary for the Malheur Lake administrative boundary. And so we've broken up the state of Oregon into these administrative boundaries, largely based on watershed characteristics there. The study area itself, again, that yellow-orange outline was a little over 5,200 square miles in size. And that encompassed the Sylvies River Basin, the Donner and Blitzen watershed, and Silver Creek watershed there. The culmination of that work has resulted so far in a number of reports, 6 of which have been published. The first 2 big ones there were the USGS groundwater hydrology report, and then the separate water budget report. OWRD put out a geologic compilation report with a map. There was a subsurface hydraulic property report, groundwater irrigation use report, and then groundwater non-irrigation use report. There were also 2 fact sheets that were put together, USGS groundwater hydrology, and then key takeaways for OWRD. There's still a couple things in progress out there. The USGS has completed the work on numerical flow model for the basin. That is, the report's been written for that, but the report is in a review, and we'll move on to a peer review process. And so those 2 things are still done, but the model is completed and calibrated. And so hopefully we'll see the report publication here in the future, not sure when. Next slide, please. So one of the key takeaways from the study comes to us through kind of what we call a water budget analysis of the basin. And that's the figure on the left. I'm not going to go into all the detail of that, but this is a way of looking at a basin, looking at inflows to the basin and outflows or discharge from the basin. You can see the blue arrows represent recharge, so that's water into the system or inflow. And then the red arrows represent discharge from that or outflow from the basin. When we look at the lowland component there, the groundwater discharge amount exceeds the recharge amount by 110,000 acre feet per year. And again, these are numbers that were taken from kind of average conditions over a number of years, but it shows that our accounting system, if you will, is out of balance by an amount on the order of 110,000 acre feet. Next slide, please. What are the effects of having an accounting system or water budget that's out of balance? Well, one way that we kind of help visualize that and understand the basin is to measure groundwater data at a number of wells across the basin. The figure on the left there is what we call a hydrograph or multi-well hydrograph. It's showing data from a number of different wells in, I believe, is this the Weaver Springs area? Yeah, the Weaver Springs area there. The bottom axis is time running from 1960 on the left to 2020 on the right. So there's a 60-year period of time there. And then the vertical axis is groundwater elevation in feet above mean sea level. And the bottom one is 3,980 up to 4,120 feet is the vertical axis there. And you can see over time from the 60s through 1990 or so, groundwater elevations at the wells that were measured there appear to be relatively stable. And then after 1990, things start to drop off and continue to decline to this day. And that is largely a function of, again, the discharge from groundwater pumping exceeding the recharge there into the basin. The rates of decline there are a function of the local geology, the amount of recharge, and then, of course, the amount of withdrawal from that system. Next slide, please. When you look at a spatial, I guess, perspective of groundwater elevation data, you end up with a figure like we have here, which is a groundwater level contour map. It's a different way of portraying the elevations across an area, in this case, the basin. Those data, when plotted like this, provide us a lot of insight into the system there. Some of the key findings as we start to do this work and do the analysis there is that you find pumping large volumes of groundwater, when that comes out of low permeability rocks, you end up with small areas with relatively steep decline rates in them. If you're in higher permeability rocks, you have shallower drawdown or less decline, but that's spread over larger areas. And most of the groundwater pumped from these lowland wells is ancient, and it's not being replenished fast enough. So part of the study looked at the age of the groundwater that we see coming out of our wells in the basin. And a lot of that groundwater is thousands of years old, which is an indication it was recharged a long time ago. We're not seeing rapid recharge into the system. And I think that's it for the summary there.
All right, any questions?
I have a question. I'm curious about what years the actual groundwater studies were being conducted, and what relationship do you guys do we consider it to have with the kind of cyclic both temperature and precipitation that seem to occur on 10 or 20 year cycles? So I'm saying, if we took this information over the last 20 years and we took it during a 20-year drought, is there any way to have an understanding of how that might impact what your conclusions are?
Sorry, Jerry, what was the period of time that Amanda looked? Is it roughly the last 30 years?
So for the water budget, we looked at from the late 1980s. So, part of it started in the early 80s, but generally from the late 1980s to 2018 for the water budget part of the study. And did I hear a question related to the hydrograph too? I couldn't hear very well.
Not specific to the hydrograph. So, yeah, the period of time that the water budget was calculated on was from the 1980s through 2018. Certainly wet cycles and dry cycles throughout that. If you want to back it up a slide to the hydrograph. Here we're looking at roughly 60 years of groundwater record. And so you can see from 1960 through 1990, a 30-year period, not a lot of fluctuation going on. And that includes, you guys had 3 wet years down here in the early 1980s where the lake, filled up, topped the roads and created a lot of problem. And that just didn't show up definitively in the hydrographs. And of course, in those early years, we had a limited number of observation wells that we were monitoring. That was greatly expanded. I don't know, Jerry started expanding our network down here around 2010 or so.
We get out here in 2008, kind of focused in the Crane area, but we really started expanding the network really early 2015. And we really worked hard on expanding the network between 2015 and 2017.
And the bulk of the study was done 2015 to 2020.
Yeah, the bulk of the study was done from 2016 to 2019. And I don't know, but were those the same years we had serious droughty conditions as far as receiving moisture?
Well, we were just talking earlier today. My last year out of Baker City was 2011. That was wet. 2017 was wet. 2023 is wet. So 3 out of the last 12 years have been wet. The rest of them are pretty dry.
I'm just curious if you did an average, where would the study data come from relative to the average when it looks at precip? Just to make sure that we're not making rules that are based upon the freak last 10 years, and that this whole world's it's all freak in my assessment. So it could be that we have a freak wet 10 years or whatever. I'm just wondering how that's being handled.
You can normalize some data, but that response in groundwater levels is not Mother Nature. And we see that in different parts of the state, and it's directly attributable to groundwater development and pumping a resource. So you can see wet cycles and dry cycles in the aquifer systems out there, but this type of a response is clearly a result of development of the groundwater resource in the basin.
I'll just have to ask you personally how you know that, but we'll talk about it.
Okay. Sure. Any other questions on the first 4 slides?
Okay, no questions. Let's go ahead and get into kind of the,
Thanks. So we have 4 meetings planned for the next year. We're gonna spend 6 minutes on the groundwater review.
That was the plan.
I will find it disturbing probably this.
So I guess to that point, if I could, I'll just say that was planned, and we have certainly given a presentation on the results of the study in large community venues, smaller venues, and so that is the choice for better or worse part. I want to point out that the RAC here, some folks on the RAC were on a study advisory committee, right? And they met with us quarterly, I want to say, for 3 years or more. And so Aaron, Larissa, Mark, Tony, Steve, Brenda, probably missing some, for Brandon's online. Those folks have been kind of step by step with us along the way. And those are people that are on the RAC that can also help out and answer questions. And I guess I invite you guys to type up with your observations if you like. Obviously, Darth and Jerry are here as well. So just want to put that out there that the RAC, as was written into the rule back in 2015, had a core set that came with us through the study for several years. And that was intentional. And then we wanted to make sure that we made the RAC as inclusive as possible of affected parties. So, so we added folks in as well, but I just want to make sure to recognize that some folks have been with us through this process since the original classification rulemaking in 2015, correct? So,
yeah.
So it's been an interesting process.
Fine, I'll take the big adjustment.
Okay.
So I appreciate that. I appreciate that. There's a lot of community members that need to weigh in on this. We're gonna have to bring some time on getting them up. to speed. If you truly want a physical impact even on how it's gonna affect this community, this county, this tax base, the schools, the domestic well users, the farmers, it's gonna take more. 12 hours of scheduled meetings in the next year in order to make some of the most impactful decisions that have been made to this community since the ESA was fought out. I know I shouldn't be saying this in the first 20 minutes of the meeting, but that's what I'm doing. So I'll be quiet for as long as I can, and I'll listen more, but I don't like the trajectory that we're in on that.
Let me add to that a suggestion. If you don't involve Oregon Economic Development, Business Oregon, to help with the economic analysis, you're making a huge mistake. You guys may be experts in water. You are not experts in economics. They are supposed to be. So that's my 2 cents. Get them at the table right now. If I can say it for me, that's going to be the sticking point. What are we doing to this community?
That's my last note. Who's water resource farmers going to work with, understand the economic shift this community is coming to do.
What are we doing if we don't do this is important too, so.
Okay, it's good input. Thank you. That's what you're here for.
Okay, I want to go over kind of what the rulemaking timeline is and why timeline is, just kind of gives the reason why timeline is the way it is. So generally speaking, the rulemaking process starts with developing draft rules, and then we form the rules advisory committee. And then from there, we post in the Oregon Bulletin on the first of the month, which initiates a public comment period. And for some time, usually greater than 30 days. And then after the public comment period, we've taken all of the comments and suggestions, we compile the reports, and we bring it to the Water Resources Commission for adoption. So that's the general rulemaking process. Now for the Division 12 rulemaking process, we're doing it a little bit differently. So we're starting with the first Rules Advisory Committee RAC number 1, because we, in 2016, as Ivan and Justin just shared, we wrote into the rules that we need to convene a RAC 1 year after publication of the groundwater study. So we are starting with the RAC, and then from there, we're going to start developing the initial draft rules and start talking with you guys between RACs 2 through 5. From there, we'll have a 90-day public comment period with 2 public hearings in the basin, probably here in this room. And then from there, we're looking for a late June 2024 adoption for the Water Resources Commission for the rules. So the dates, so we know now April 25th was our first RAC. And then from August 2023 to January 2024, we're going to have RACs number 2 through 5. And then from February into April, we'll be doing that public comment period. And then June, we're looking for that June adoption. So why are we having a 3-month period in between RAC 1 and RAC number 2? In order to talk about that, we need to kind of talk about the 3 tools that the department has for addressing the USGS findings, right? So the first tool we have is classification, and that's for curtailing future use. So the example of that was in 2016, we made the give deck and we closed down that area to encourage groundwater development. We have that tool already available to us in statute, so that would be RS 536.340. Then we have a significant water management planning area, a SWAMPA. So that's going to be used for measuring current use. We have rules that dictate how we need to implement those, and that's our Division 690, Chapter 85 rules. And the last tool that we have is a critical groundwater designation or Division 10. We do not have this tool available to us yet. So Tim, Ivan, and I are currently taking those rules through the rulemaking process. We are doing the public comment period now. We actually have a public hearing in this room tomorrow for Division 10. So if you wish to add some comments to those rules, please come in. It's from 5 to 7. We'd love to have you. And we're looking for that for June 15th adoption, right? So we can't do a designation until we get those rules adopted. Right, it's just kind of more reiteration on the timeline, right? So in June, we're gonna get these Division 10 rules adopted. And then RAC 2, we're gonna start having that conversation on what are the boundaries, what kind of classification kind of things that we're having that conversation with RAC, starting in RAC 2 and going through 5. RAC that we are planning for 5. Now, I want to make a point that if we need more RACs, we will do more RACs. That is not, there's not a drop dead date. Please go ahead.
I'm sorry, Gary.
Yeah.
Can you go back a slide?
Sure.
So those are the only tools the department has in order to use less water in the basin? No.
Hi, can I ask that folks, again, please state your name and then ask your question. It's hard for the folks online to follow the conversation in the room.
Who was that?
That's Laura.
That's me. So just say, your name and then, ask your question and then we can kind of track.
Mark Owens. So those aren't only tools that the department has to work with communities to reduce water. Just going to repeat what we've done in other basins? Or are we looking to try to do something different in this basin? We've committed collectively, the department members of this building, thousands and thousands of hours on this since 2015 and before. I'm trying to figure out, are we just checking the boxes? Are we actually going to try to do something different? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
No, we're here to listen. What Kelly's presenting here are the things that we have available to us in rule. Voluntary agreements are briefly mentioned in statute in a really generic sense. Place-based planning process has gone on down here. That's still continuing to go on. I guess in an indirect way, it's certainly an opportunity to look at different ways for water management in the basin, but we're trying to get us to a point where we can deal with some of the significant issues. We have an ability to continue allocation in this basin. The groundwater was classified back in 2016 within that GIVGAC area, so the smaller kind of shaded area within the study area. The basin study found that we're dealing with one groundwater reservoir system from up in Grant County down to the Donner and Blitzen system, basically. So we still have some of those areas that theoretically are open for continued groundwater development. That's one of the issues that we'd like to deal with sooner rather than later. We have 10 feet or more of decline occurring in the Weaver Springs area today per year. That's the worst decline rate we have in the state of Oregon, I'm aware of. So time is important to dealing with some of the management issues out there. So we want to move this process forward efficiently, and it's still going to take us years to do that. So Mark, I understand you're a little frustrated today with the way we're starting the presentation. We've got lots of time to work on these things and to roll in some of these other opportunities out there. You help us figure out where the best places to do that are. You help us figure out how we should come down here and engage with the public, what level of frequency and when to do that. We're open to that kind of input. So we're trying to balance the limitations we have on staff resources with everything else that we want to try and accomplish in this space, and given all the negative impacts that are occurring from these declines that are going on out there. So we're here to listen. We want to get through the presentation today so we can set for you what some of the process looks like. It's not the whole process. it's not everything, but we have to start someplace. Alexandria?
Yeah, for folks online, this is Alexandria Scott with the Oregon Water Resources Department. I just want to highlight too something that maybe we didn't mention earlier, but back in November of last year, we had a community meeting and we talked a little bit about the integrated approach and how we were thinking about groundwater level stabilization in the basin. And we actually highlighted, right, there's two sides of the coin. So there's regulatory and there's voluntary. And voluntary is really where the place-based planning, the voluntary agreements, those gain traction. And we have folks from the place-based planning group on our rules advisory committee. I meet with them every month and give them updates on how to prepare for the rulemaking. So we do have folks at the table to help advocate for some of the strategies in the groundwater portion of their place-based planning. So just for newer folks in the audience or folks online, that's just another thing to consider today, is that we do have folks that can advocate for the kind of voluntary strategies and ideas. So we do have folks involved and their voices heard at the table today.
Any questions or comments? All right, then you're ready to move on. Okay, so what I was explaining, so we got some really good conversation, is that so in between the first rack and the second rack, we're looking to get those Division 10 critical groundwater area designation rules, one of the tools that we need to for Harney Basin to get adopted in June 15th. I know Alexandria and I have been saying a lot of what Division 10. So what exactly is Division 10? Let's get into that real quick. Okay, so Division 10 is the critical groundwater area designation rules. It is essentially this, and not essentially, it is the steps that the department needs to follow to get a designation in a basin. It lays out all the requirements, like who do we need to notify during public notification? We have to notify all groundwater users in the basin. It lays out stuff like how many times we do public hearings. So it's all the steps that we need to follow. And is the only tool that OWRD, to my knowledge, has to curtail existing groundwater use and then implement correct control measures. Actually, like 5 of you here have helped with the Division 10. We're part of the RAC process. And so we want to say thank you for that. Okay, so this is from the critical groundwater area rulemaking flow sheet that I sent to you guys. They're in one of my emails. So this, we're just gonna kind of walk through to kind of demonstrate the process that the department needs to follow. All right, so there are 7 different conditions, and note that these notes here are summaries of what the statute says. And that critical groundwater flow sheet, we actually have word for word what the statute says. But if the department finds that one of these conditions are being met in the basin, they may initiate the critical groundwater designation process. So that's going to be right here on node A, right? So we find that a basin is being a certain condition. Then we start drafting the rules, and there are certain things that need to be included in those rules. Very difficult to throw this mouse on this screen over here. Okay. There are certain things there are certain requirements that we need to write in that rules, like what is the boundary of the rules. We need to have a requirement for every 10 years checking the basin conditions to see if the rules need to be changed, as well every 3 years if it's adopted by the Water Resources Board. If a rule curtailing groundwater or curtailing any kind of water use, we have 3-year review, right? So those are the kind of things that need to be implemented into those draft rules. And then from there, set C here and Division 10, we need to consult with the federally localized tribes within the basin and then coordinate with affected local government. We coordinate with affected local government to make sure that our rules are in line with their land use planning. And then we need to consult with the tribes. And then that's going to bring us over here into RAC 2. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that the steps B and C, we need to take within the next 3 months. Between now and August, the department needs to follow these steps for RAC 2. And just to be fair, that we know the steps we have to take. We're not sure how we take those steps. This is the first time that we have done a critical groundwater area designation in 30 years. And the team here was not, to my knowledge, you guys can chime in, was not part of OWRD 30 years ago when we did one in 1990. Right, so we have a new set of rules, these Division 10 rules, that we need to frankly figure out how we do each step. We have some idea, but we need to make those steps prior to that second RAC. Right, so then after the RAC, so we're looking at section D here. We then have to do, we kind of follow the normal rulemaking process. So we start notification process. And again, like I said, Division 10 lays out certain people we need to notify. And then we begin that public comment phase. And then lastly, on section and step G there, that's when we prepare that staff report and bring it to the Water Resources Commission. So just to reiterate, we have to do steps B and C before RAC number 2. So that's why we have in our schedule, we have a 3-month break. Yes.
So Steve Grasky, the RAC number 2 does what? What's their function to actually say we're curtailing this water?
No, so RAC number 2 is just gonna be another meeting of this group. And at that meeting, we intend to provide you with, preferably before, we'll provide you with a copy of the draft rules. And we'll have an agenda for which rules we're going to talk through. And so you'll have a copy of what we're proposing, and we'll be looking for your input into those rules. So that language.
On the critical groundwater.
On a critical groundwater area designation, we'll most likely also be looking at a swamp designation, which is a serious water management problem area designation. That allows us to implement accountability measures like requiring flow meters and water use reporting. And then any other changes to the rules that we think need to be made. But we'll get into that more when we talk about the scope, which is going to come here just in a little bit. So we'll definitely dive more into that in a little bit, if that's okay, Steve.
Yeah, Brenda Smith. So just for clarification, I understand the sense of urgency, but these meetings have been set, but does this have to occur by June of 2020?
No, so yeah, so very flexible on that part, right? So we have the RACs are set, but as I said, if we need more RACs, we'll do more RACs. So we don't need to get this adopted by June. I mean, their urgency and sense that the groundwater levels are going down, but we don't want to rush this process. We want to work with you as we go through this.
But those meeting dates have been set, so we have to get to.
Oh, okay,
B
I
and C
understand. I'm
by
sorry, I
August, right?
misunderstood you.
Okay.
So Division 10 passed the RAC process. It's almost, the public comment period is almost over, and we're going to bring the Division 10 rules to the Water Resources Commission in a couple of months for adoption. So the rules that we need will be adopted before RAC number 2. Does that make sense? Am I being clear?
So the Division 10 rules lay out the process that this group, that the department needs to follow with this group in order to
Right.
designate a critical groundwater area.
Yeah,
And we have set this timeline for a chance to meet, because that's the time in which we believe we'll be able to provide you with draft rules and have met the requirements of this process. And that is the next available time that we felt we could meet that deadline and then bring this group together and begin talking about that. And we didn't want to delay any longer than that because we want to keep this process moving forward, right?
okay.
Does that answer
But
your
it's not
question?
in like the rulemaking that it has to happen by. a
There is
certain
nothing in rule currently around Division 10 that says it has to be adopted by a certain point.
Or even these 512.
There is nothing in 512. I believe 512 said we had to have this meeting by
Within
this
a year,
April.
But
Within the year of the within a year of publishing the study, we would have this meeting. And so we are meeting the requirements of the rule by having this meeting.
correct.
And now I do not believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Ivan, there is no timeline within rule stating how quickly we must get through this process.
Okay, that's exactly what I was asking.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for clarifying, because that, yeah, it's confusing. Yeah.
Crystal.
Any other questions, comments? I want to ignore the fact that the RAC members, you are just as important, I promise. Okay. All right, so just kind of a summary, before next RAC, the department staff prepare draft rules for a series water, and we're gonna get more, Tim's gonna get more in detail of this, but let's go. All right, so we're gonna prepare draft rules for a serious water management problem area, critical groundwater area boundary, groundwater classification, and the required Division 10 requirements that we need to meet before next RAC, that's in August 29th, I believe, is we need to draft a report for the Water Resources Commission. That's laid out in Division 10. We need to begin consultation with federally recognized tribes and begin our coordination with affected local governments.
And to be clear, these are all things the department is working on.
Yes.
So there'll be nothing for this group until RAC number 2, in preparation for RAC number 2, when we deliver draft rules for you to review ahead of that meeting. So this, Mark, Tim clarified that. So there'll be nothing for this group until our next RAC meeting. Related to this process specifically, and in preparation for the next meeting, no. Related to the other work, right? So we're talking about the regulatory side with this process. Related to the voluntary side, there's absolutely work that can be done. Figuring out ways, of reducing usage, place-based planning, advocating for voluntary agreements, etc. So absolutely, this group has things it can work on. But related to this process specifically and the draft rules for Division 512, there will be nothing to review until we provide you with a set of draft rules.
And as RAC members, you can also provide written input or give a call to me or Alexandria, and we'll accept any input before the next RAC.
But the main purpose of this meeting was to just meet your deadline.
It's to meet the deadline and start the process.
That's what all this.
But let me, sorry, if I could just clarify that, so in other rulemakings, at the first RAC, we typically show up with strike through and additions to the rules and say, this is what we're proposing, let's start talking about this. So the reason we're having this in April is because of the timeline, but the reason that we're having this early is because many of you have been along with us again for years. And we want to make sure that we have a chance to discuss and engage with you before we ever make an edit to the rules, right? Like, that's been something that we've heard before as feedback, right? Is that you guys want to have meaningful input. And so this is an opportunity to have that conversation and provide input before we ever draft any changes to discuss, right? We don't want to anchor the changes to what we come up with. So that's a difference from our typical way of doing it.
So Justin, Mark, when is that going to occur before the next RAC? So we're going to talk about scope here at 3:15. And help us start with that.
We started with scope.
We had Mark from the beginning. Sorry, Mark. I'll take that under advisement next time. So we'll talk about scope 3:15 to 3:45. I'll present on that. And then 3:45 to 4:15, we'll talk about what things you all think should be added, or what we shouldn't talk about, where we should focus, where we shouldn't focus. So that's where we're going to get your feedback and your input today. So Tim, Mark, last comment on this one. In scope or farther during today, is somebody going to explain what groundwater classification means? Yes, I'll be working on that. Okay. Yep. So I will define the top 3 bullets will get defined, and we'll talk through each one.
Hey, Laura, I see that you have your hand up.
Yeah, no, I can't tell if you can see me or my hand or whatnot. There is a question or two in the chat, so I'm trying to figure out if folks are monitoring the chat or if I need to draw attention to the fact that there are folks virtually that.
Yeah,
have some
we're
questions.
monitoring the chat, Laura. And
Okay.
we'll address those questions a little later.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, because they're from a member of the.
They're not from a RAC member, so we'll address that during the public comment period. We'll address that question. So thank you, Ken. We see your question and we're answering in the public comment period. Okay, so that is the end of the rulemaking section. Then we're gonna kind of go over to, I would say, Andrea, she's gonna give us a quick recap. Actually, I'm not gonna take your thunder. You can go ahead and tell what you said.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you folks are not aware, but if you are aware, so March 7th through the 9th, Kelly and I were out here in Burns and we attended some local meetings. We met on one-on-one conversations with folks. We met with a couple small groups, and we really wanted, before the rulemaking kicked off, to hear some of the groundwater concerns from folks, help orient people to why is this rulemaking happening? What does it mean? What does this language of Division 10, Division 512, why are they important? Why should the community be paying attention, plugging in, having community voices heard? We also collected some Rules Advisory Committee nominations while we were out in the community. So it was really a chance for us to start building a foundation and understanding with folks. And we got some really good feedback from the community. So as you'll see up here, we got some suggestions on who should be invited to serve on the Rules Advisory Committee. So we had recommendations such as the community-based water planning group, the groundwater study advisory committee, representation from the Harney Natural Resource Advisory Committee, domestic well users, irrigators. So lots of common threads that we have heard just over 6 years of working on the groundwater study. And so we responded to that by reaching out to folks, working with local community organizations to find out who they wanted to represent them. And we ended with the RAC we have now based on some of that feedback that we have received. Another portion was that people gave us some recommendations of what they wanted to know at this first RAC meeting. So they wanted to hear, what is the timeline? What is the scope? Who are the Rules Advisory Committee members? What does a Rules Advisory Committee do? So we drafted a lot of our presentation from what we heard from folks, along with what we do for normal Rules Advisory Committee meetings. Another portion was how to share information with the community. So we heard, put information out in the local newspaper, go on the local radio, work with local organizations using their social media or their email listservs to help get the information out. Use community boards in Erickson's store. I mean, just as much as you can do, put flyers out in the post office. So we really tried with those March community conversations to find out how best to share information with you all, so we can make sure that you feel heard, your voices are being represented in this rulemaking, and we've got diverse representation. So one other piece that we heard ringing true was that folks really wanted to know about water use and accountability. And one way that that can be done through rulemaking is with a serious water management problem area. And so it was really great to actually hear community members advocating for, hey, we want to understand how water is being used, at what quantities. Maybe we will be more conscious in our decisions if we understand how water is being used. And so it was a great way to kind of align what we were thinking or maybe recommending with what we were hearing from the community as well. So again, those community conversations were a great way to start to kick things off and also gauge how much people knew about the groundwater situation out here. Were they aware of the groundwater study? Were they aware of the work of the community-based water planning group? And really start to build that understanding early so we could enter into this process well-informed and where we still need to do some work with either outreach or building a better understanding. So those community conversations were really helpful, I think, not only for me as an engagement coordinator for the department, but also for Kelly as the rules coordinator for this to help us understand how best to help you. So that was kind of the outcomes of those March community conversations. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to either answer them now or answer them during the break or after the meeting as well. And I produced a one-page document. It's on the Water Resources website that encapsulates all of this. So if anybody's interested in that as well, I'm happy to provide it for you.
Questions or comments? Thank you so much. All right, let's go ahead and get into what we're all ready for. Let's go ahead and talk about the scope of the rulemaking.
Do we want to do that before we take a break? We're ahead of schedule by about 10 minutes, so we could start it on scope. Or we could take a break and then come back and start scope.
Let's take a break.
Let's take 10 minutes then. We'll start back up at 3:05. Does that work? Yeah, so yeah, exactly. The rulemaking. So can we go to the next slide, Kelly? All right, so as we talked about earlier, the couple things we know, we have excessive groundwater declines in parts of the Harney Basin. We have the lowland groundwater budget is out of balance by 110,000 acre feet, as Ivan said. And so we're going to talk specifically about 3 tools the department has from a regulatory standpoint to work on addressing these problems. So the first is a critical groundwater area designation. The second we're going to talk about is significant water management problem area. I'm going to call that a SWAMPA over and over again because it's easier to say than significant water management problem area or serious water management problem area. I can never remember which one it is. I probably wrote it wrong right there. And then classification is the last one we're going to talk about. So next slide. We'll start talking about critical groundwater area. And this slide is really busy, but I wanted to put as much information as I could to make it hopefully clear. So ORS 536-730 authorizes the Water Resource Commission to designate a critical groundwater area when any of these 7 criteria are met. So Kelly talked a little bit about that in your pre-RAC materials. You should have gotten flow charts that talk about that as well. But the first one is a critical one, and it's one that we've met. So groundwater levels are declining or have declined excessively. Excessively declining is defined as 3 feet per year for 10 years, or have declined 50 feet below the highest known value. That would be excessively declined. So we saw in that hydrograph from earlier, we have declines in the Harney Basin on groundwater wells that are well beyond 50 feet. So we've met the definition of excessively declined within the basin. So right there, all by itself, we have met the criteria, the statutory criteria for designating a critical groundwater area. Mark. Thanks, Dave. So you're saying basins. So are we talking around here river basins? We talking sub basins? We talking groundwater reservoirs, which are also aquifers is defined. So I'm confused what you're talking here because we have all those conditions in all of those areas.
Yep. So the statute specifically says excessively declining or declined within a groundwater reservoir or part thereof. So the groundwater study has stated, and the conclusions from that are that the groundwater reservoir is the entire Harney Basin. So if you jump ahead just a couple slides, Kelly, there's a version of the map again. So that colored area that's orange or yellow or whatever color you see that as, I don't know what color I see it as clearly. I think it's orange. That is the Harney Basin study area, and that is what we consider the groundwater reservoir. So we have met through the fact that we have groundwater declines that are excessive in a part of that groundwater reservoir. It is possible to declare the entire basin a critical groundwater area. We are not proposing that at this moment. We don't have a proposal for you for boundaries. I'm letting you know what the criteria are and what the maximum size could be based on that criteria. So if we go back a couple slides back to where we were. So the second one piece of criteria that we've met is yeah, absolutely, Mark.
So by definition of OR 69.025.0020, you're calling the groundwater reservoir the whole study area.
Correct. Because it's all hydraulically connected.
And I have a question, Roger, do we have data that allows us to parse them into smaller pieces?
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. Any other questions?
There's no way.
If there's more than one critical area, isn't there? I mean, real down like you're losing 10 foot a year, there's more than one of those in there. In the county, isn't there?
There are places where we have
declines. Yes, more than just Weaver Springs, correct, Eric and Barry?
Weaver Springs is the only one that's declining at that high of a rate. Other areas across the basin, we're seeing declines at lower rates than that. That is the worst decline rate in space.
But there are more than one. Across the county.
Across the study here.
Across the study here. Can you state your name first, please?
Tony,
Tony?
not to point fingers at anybody, but we have this meeting and we all go along with it. And you showed us that that critical area could be that whole zone. I mean, you have it right now. It's where it is. You're choosing to not pick it while we're all sitting here. But you're choosing to change when you go back.
We have not made a proposal,
You have not made a proposal.
and that proposal will make that
How do we
at
guarantee-
RAC number 2. At RAC meeting number 2 is when you'll hear that proposal.
Before it's made. I mean, you're gonna make a proposal. It's a proposal, not
Correct?
find out it already was done. There's
Correct.
no way you would ever do anything before anybody could talk about
Correct.
it. Never do it
No.
behind anybody's back.
Nothing will be adopted at RAC 2. There will be a chance for input across RAC number 2, across RAC number 3, across RAC number 4, across RAC number 5. And then through the public comment period, before we get to any sort of rules that would go before the Water Resource Commission.
No emergency, whoops, we slipped it in, forgot to tell you. It'll have to be publicly.
We are going to be as transparent as we possibly can.
I'm just meaning someone above you can't slip over you and say, no.
Tony, has someone done you wrong?
Just-
No. We got your message, thank you.
All right, so the second, yes, absolutely.
Kristen Shulman. So one thing that I would like to see when you do come back with, proposed, 512, markouts, whatever you want to call them, just like with a lot of other things that, we deal with, are you going to give us alternatives within that? Are you going to have just singularity, kind of like what they did with the Division 10, where it's just struck out and there's one other selection that's being proposed? Or within this type of basin rule, are we going to have different alternatives that the Water Resource Department is proposing within these changes? Because I think as we look at this, kind of back to what Roger even said, sub-basins within the basin, how do we arrive at that conclusion of what a sub-basin is within the basin? What's the science behind that? How much is this group going to be brought along with supporting that science that's being proposed to delineate those areas within the basin? If you take the whole Mount Basin, obviously, that goes clear to the Nevada border. What does that look like? We're not just talking about the north part of the county, we're talking about countywide when we look at this. And so if we're proposing that, potentially, what are the alternatives within that of addressing specific sub-basins? How many of those options are we going to have? Where would, proposed voluntary agreements be something that the department would suggest versus because of this certain trigger, this will be our main proposal, but in some of these areas where we're seeing less decline, are we going to have different alternatives that this group can look at?
I'll take that one, Kristen. And I think maybe what I'll do is step back a little bit. Why do we care about groundwater levels going down? I mean, ask the fundamental question, why does that even matter? Wells are going dry, not just here, across the state. Pumping costs increase. The resource gets more limited with time. And by that, I mean, the deeper you go, practice has shown you start running into warmer water conditions and usually water quality conditions at depth. And this is as you get, 1,000, 2,000 feet down. There's a bottom somewhere there. And then on top of that, we have a law that says we need to manage this stuff largely in a sustainable fashion, get to these reasonably stable groundwater levels across the state of Oregon. And so there's a lot of reasons why Trying to get to stability of the groundwater resource matters from a management perspective, kind of from our little world, that's what we do, but also from your world. If we keep going, some generations from now, it's not your kids, they're not gonna run out of water. Could be the grandkids or the great grandkids, who knows? But it's something that we want to start putting the brakes on to look down the road for sustainability, keeping the economic base going as best we can in this county, because a lot of it's around irrigated agriculture. The critical area is a tool that our agency has. It's ultimately the stick. The rules that we're talking about, establishing a critical groundwater area boundary, that's all it really is. Within that boundary, we can do some things so we don't develop more groundwater. We don't want to make the declines worse. We want to protect the existing users who are all senior to any new development that's going on. And a lot of the statutes that Tim is going to go through here really aren't relevant here in Harney. We're not worried about geothermal resources right now or geothermal interference. We're not worried about water quality. Surface water groundwater connection is an issue in some area where there's spring discharge. As groundwater levels decline, we will dry up those springs. So whatever's dependent on those springs goes away if we don't stop these declines from continuing on down. So there's a lot of important things to deal with, and that's what this whole process is about. Within the critical area boundary, we throw a lasso around some geographic area based on science. That's going to be at a minimum part of the groundwater reservoir. We can have sub areas within there that look at the specific problem areas. And that's sort of where we're sitting today, what we think would be a good approach. We'll lay that out there for you to look at. We'll lay out the supporting data, and you can ask the questions and see if you have better thoughts or other ideas as to how to manage those. But largely, we're looking at groups of pumping wells that are responding similarly. They're in close proximity, within miles of each other. And it seems like that's a manageable unit to deal with. That's what we'll probably lay out there as the straw man for you folks to take a look at and see, does that seem reasonable to us? So the big critical area boundary, sub areas within that, and that'll be a starting place for the conversation. And so I'm going to stop there. I'll be happy to take any questions, and then we'll talk more about the other things.
Did that speak to your question about alternatives?
You don't have very many alternatives, Jeff.
So I think from a boundary perspective, we're going to propose what we think is the right thing. And then we'll get into the details, right? And that's going to be based on the science we've done, and we will present on that. And we will present on the criteria that we use to make these decisions. And then you can provide input on that, and we'll go from there. But we have to have a starting point. And that's how the process works. So I think on some of the other items, classification, et cetera, it's possible to provide potentially alternatives and options for how we would do it. Yes. Any other questions?
Let's Steve Grassy. So two things, I think, as Commissioner Sheldon talks about this, one of the things that I keep hearing alluded to is how much voice do we really have? And I hope it's a lot as this process goes forward. And I think we got to have a draft to be able to work from it. And then I'd like to see something, Kelly, I'm looking at you, but some way that we can send questions in that the entire group sees and the responses to them. So that we just don't walk in and spend all our time answer a question that we'd already known what it was.
Yeah, absolutely. So you could email me questions. If I don't know the answer, I'll talk to these guys, and then I do let all the RAC members know the answer to the question. So that is, I am available for any form of communication. Yeah.
Any other questions from the group?
Well, Ben McCann's got one more to throw in there. I read that study, or went through that study pretty good. And a lot of these questions were answered in the study, in my opinion. So, I'm just saying that the information's out there. You want to take the time to look at it.
Just one back, Ben, what question specific are you referring to?
Well, you were asking about the difference, how can they move it all into one big area?
No, I was talking about how they're going to arrive at sub-basin with that, the science that they have, how can they help us understand what science is used to arrive at sub-basin, not the greater area?
And a lot of that was in the study.
And we will absolutely get into that when we get there.
Right.
And we'll talk to that, absolutely. All right, so I'm gonna go on to the next point. The second criteria that we've met is that the groundwater supply is or is about to be overdrawn. Again, within any part of that groundwater reservoir. And overdrawn is defined as annual pumpage in any 1 year period exceeds annual average recharge. So we've got a couple of sections within the study area where that criteria has been met. And so we have 2 places where we've met the criteria for critical groundwater area designation. So at this point, I want to move on to the next slide and let's talk about what does critical groundwater area designation actually authorize us to do. So ORS 536-735 then provides these rules that may be adopted in a critical groundwater area designation. So the first one is a provision closing the critical groundwater area to further appropriation. And this also allows for the refusal of any application for a new permit. So essentially the critical area can be closed and the department does not have to accept any applications there. This is different than what the GIVGAC is currently because new applications can still come in. We've simply classified and said we will say no to the application, but applications can still come in and they have to be reviewed. So that's a key difference there. The second thing is a provision determining the permissible total withdrawal of groundwater in the critical area each day, month, or year. So this is where a provision can be set for the critical area for how much water is allowed to be used within that critical area. And with our Division 10 rules, we've stated that we can also break that down into sub areas within the critical groundwater area. So it's not just total for the entire area, but it can be total for the entire area. And then with sub areas within that can be broken down even further. And obviously all the sub areas should add up to the total area water usage. So that's another thing that's allowed to be written into rule here. Key difference here though is this rule does not curtail any water use yet. So even if this rule is adopted, water use cannot be curtailed until we have gone through a contested case process and everybody has had their opportunity to contest any order curtailing use. So while we may set an actual limit to the water use for a critical area, no water use gets shut off until final orders have been issued by the Water Resource Commission after a contested case hearing has been held. So there's 2 steps to this process to curtail use. The first is to set in rule what the total use can be. And then the second process would happen after those rules are adopted. There would be orders from the Water Resource Commission curtailing use, and then the implementation of those curtailment orders after a contested case hearing. So there's multiple steps to this process. In this process, the Division 512 rulemaking, what we're looking at is setting the total permissible withdrawal for that critical groundwater area and for those sub areas. So setting how much water can be used. And we won't be looking at specifically what the orders will be curtailing that use. We'll absolutely talk about who would be affected, what that looks like, but we will not have an order issued until after these rules are adopted.
This is really, I think, an important part for everybody to understand is how involved the critical area designation is. Just the rule process. We're setting up the boundary, setting up sub areas, possibly doing some of these other things here, but nobody gets shut off. Nobody's regulated by that process. There's no curtailment, no changes to exempt use wells. everybody keeps using the same amount of water that they've been using with the process that we're dealing with in these rules here today. Going beyond that, so when these rules get adopted in 18 months or longer, so that's a year and a half out, continue what we're doing for that long. That gives folks a lot of time to start looking at these sub areas. It gives folks to start figuring out priority dates within the sub areas. We'll have water use numbers and estimates for each of those sub areas. And we'll also have what we believe to be based on the data and the rate of groundwater level decline in those sub areas. What's the reasonably stable or sustainable annual yield is a term that we use a lot. How much can be pumped to only have 1 foot of decline per year, or a half a foot of decline per year, or 5 feet of decline per year? We can provide those numbers and they're going to be pretty accurate. That information is going to help place-based planning. It's going to help local groups of groundwater pumpers get together and be like, wow, it looks like we might need to do X if we want to get to this condition. So they'll start to have numbers and can start to have conversations about how are we as a water user community in this sub area going to start reducing our groundwater use in order to get to some target that we think we ought to be at. I don't know that the department's going to agree with the target that the water users want to agree. That's going to be the squishy stuff. How fast do we get there and where do we end up are really the two critical questions I think that are out there for folks to consider. Understand that we're really embarking on a fairly lengthy process here, and that's step 1 of step 2. And step 2 is actually a much more involved and lengthy process. If voluntary agreements don't get us to the reductions in groundwater use, if the CREP program, Graham's here tonight, he can talk about the CREP program that we're working on. Other options and alternatives that the community can come up with to reduce groundwater pumping to stabilize those groundwater levels. If those things in total don't get us to where we need to go across the basin or within these sub areas, then the department's tool is the next step, step 2 of the critical groundwater area designation process. And that is a long, involved process. We haven't designated a critical area and done curtailments in over 30 years. I'll leave it at that. Happy to answer questions, but I'm hoping that this is helping folks understand kind of how this process could unfold and the timelines that are involved just with the process. And that's if everything goes well. So, sir, you had a question?
Yes, Jim Campbell. So I understood this part of the process, it can be contested. But I'm not clear on, is the contested area the entire area designated, or is it water right by water right? Contested?
So,
and if it's the big area, who would have standing to do that?
yeah, I'll try and answer your question, and if I don't, we'll see if I can better understand it. Any rule that our agency or any agency adopts can be contested, and I think largely in 2 ways, and I'm not an expert on this. One, we didn't follow the statewide rule process appropriately, and so your process was incorrect, and you guys need to go back to step 1 and start over. Or 2, you created rules that aren't supported by the underlying statutes there. We don't have the authority to do that, and so that can be the contest of the rules.
It's a process contest, not a content.
It could be content. Again, the rules that we adopt, if they don't line up with statute, that can result in a contest, and the rules would be kicked out through the Court of Appeals. Or the process, if we don't do it right, can be booted back to the Court of Appeals, and we start over at that point in time. So did that answer your question?
It did.
Okay. Mark.
Mark, thanks, Ivan. Your explanation of the community will be providing options in different areas to work through slowing down the rate of decline. So, okay, so that helps a lot of the conversation that is just not the check the box that we're going to be actively engaged. So let me just help summarize. So the designation of critical groundwater doesn't have to lead to curtailment of water to regulatory.
Correct.
So if a critical groundwater designation is made, there still would be options even in sub areas to get community input on what would be the best way to meet desired goals and how to reach those.
Yes.
Ben Kern, I'm the farm manager, in Blue Springs. And from a practical standpoint, what is the process? Because I'm not as a family agent, you know, a member of the RAC. But I'm responsible for, you know, making decisions from a, you know, ongoing planning standpoint on water usage. From a practical standpoint, how, and when, would we engage in understanding, okay, here's, what I totally expect, you know, Weaver Springs would be a, you know, the epicenter of the groundwater area, right? Practically, then how do we engage with OWRD and say, you know, okay, here's how much, you know, you think is reasonable, and here's what we think. Will there be another set of meetings? You know, how will we ensure we have a seat at that table to actually, you know, participate in the process actively?
Okay, it's a good question, Ben. And I'm not sure if everybody heard him, but, you know, how is an individual user in a sub area or the broader area going to participate in this process? I don't want to speak out of turn here, but I think Jerry and Dara are working now on groups of wells that would fall within a sub area and estimates of the groundwater use that's occurring and what might end up being sustainable. So kind of what's happening today, what do we think the target might be to get us to reasonably stable groundwater levels? Once that information is available, we'll share it with anybody that wants it. And really, I want folks in the Weaver Springs area, starting as soon as possible, to talk to one. The other thing that we will provide that will be helpful is a list of water rights by priority date, by current ownership. Who's the junior, who's the senior, all the way through for that group of wells in that sub area, if you will. And that will help put into perspective for folks, how much groundwater do we think is being used today? What do we think is a sustainable target? And what does that mean? You know, well, there's differences. There is 5 feet per year. That's more groundwater use than 1 foot per year of decline going on there. And, but that should very quickly provide almost all the data needed for folks to start thinking about, what are my options? Is prep a good option? Should I take a circle and get it into prep as soon as I can, so I can slow my share of the decline? What are other options for voluntary curtailments? Are there water bank options? Can we do groundwater rotations? How do we share a resource? What do we want to do as a group? Do we want everybody to keep a piece of the pie? Or do we just want the seniors to keep a piece of the pie? Well, if you're a junior, you're going to have a different perspective than a senior on that. There's going to be a lot of interesting conversations amongst the groundwater users. We can sit there and provide technical information and answer questions, but the voluntary portion of this is going to be groundwater user to groundwater user, trying to figure out what it is you guys want to do. I'm not a farmer, not a business person. We were talking on the ride down today about groundwater rotation opportunities. What does that look like? We don't know. I don't know from an alfalfa perspective if that's the bulk of what's being grown down here for the commercial crop. You can't grow it on an acre foot per year. You can keep it alive, I think, maybe. You know, but what does that do? Is that one cutting you get out of it? So those are the types of data that we can provide, and I think that will help folks start to engage while this process continues on. Again, in my mind, time is important, and I hope I share that with you, and I hope you all walk away with that. It's much easier on us to start a process today of slowing down our groundwater use than it is to delay for 10 or 20 years and then maybe have to come to a much harder stop. So I'd like to see something, I know Mark does, more gradual, longer term, but by that, we need to get the process started. You don't have to wait on us, you can start today. I'm sure that's not in your business interest, but that's certainly a tool that's available for all of you.
I have a question. This is Leslie Richmond, I'm an irrigator here. So is there ever going to be actual data that we submit about our water use that's going to be utilized instead of just an estimate of what our permits are? Because we've all been, many of us have sent in water use reports. Many of us are using a whole lot less water than what our permitted water rate is. And I think that should be taken into consideration.
Jerry?
It has been taken into consideration. The report by Beamer and Hospital in 2021 uses that water reported data. And we also use the satellite evapotranspiration data. And, we figure about, depending on which field you're looking at, from 50 to 75% of what's permitted is actually being used, depending on which field you're looking at. So that was taken into consideration. So we didn't use the full authorized amount when we estimated the actual. We did the best we could from the satellite data and from the reported data to estimate based on what the actual use really was.
Yeah. Tony again, in the defense of the water resource, I know everybody was thinking I was jabbing into water resources. We worked religiously with the Department of Water Resources, who everyone there, we actually have a great relationship, but where a lot of problem arises is beyond you guys. Even though I can meet minimum standards, I can do everything I'm supposed to do, that if the well is a total legal well, it could be 30, 60, 90 days later that retaliation comes back out of your building. It isn't you. It's above you. It's a water rights. It's a different department that reviews the wells, reviews the water rights, and then they have issues about, oh, is it in the proper spot or proper seal? We spent a lot of time with John Montgomery trying to make sure, is this well put in the proper place? Is it going to match that water? Does it get a proper seal? Does it have enough pipe? We do all this and we meet your standards. I mean, it seems like we've had no problem meeting your standard, at least minimum or better. And then it's the water rights that is scary. That is where a lot of intimidation comes from a lot of people, because you might not be the one to put your foot down and say this is a deadline. It might, there's a lot of fear of water rights. It's a different division. I know it's not you, but I know that's what people fear. That is why I tried to make it clear, and I thought, I got the feeling you might be thinking I was jabbing you. I'm talking beyond you. That's where the fear is. So I just want to make that clear.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Billy.
Sorry, this is just a process comment, but I think it might be helpful for people in the room who, I got to sit on the RAC about the section 10 rule. And it was a real shock to me when I thought we were done, and instead we went right into the contested case process. And I go, why are we busy making rules, assuming this is going to get challenged and all that? There's a lot of protection built into this whole process by the fact that creating a critical groundwater area automatically takes it clear into the contested case process. And the second thing I learned sitting on that RAC, because this issue potentially impacts water right users and doesn't, if you read the law carefully, exempt wells are pretty much untouched in this process with respect to curtailment. But the public doesn't know that. And there's a lot of misinformation. So one of the things that came out in the section 10 process is some of us pushed hard to include notifying all the exempt well users in one of these areas, even though curtailment doesn't affect them directly. Because there's a lot of unhappiness about the rules because people don't understand them. And the more we all understand these rules, the better. And that's built into that process. And I just wanted to share that with you.
And the name for the record?
Oh, I'm sorry. Judy Boyko.
Yep, I'm Roger Shealy. I'm curious about, I hear a lot about establishing water use amounts. Does that assume that the input is static and based on it just being the same each year? Because that can't be the case.
So recharge to the aquifer system is not static. It varies based on the nature of the water year, how much total precipitation, snow melt. We're dealing with unusual weather the last 10, 20 years. We seem to be in a drying trend and a warming trend across the state. And it raises lots of questions about as we get less snowfall and more rain, how does that impact recharge? So, Roger, there are things we don't know yet, and we'll learn as time goes on. But generally, I'll take you back to your mind to the hydrograph I showed the multiple wells on there. That 1960 through 1990, those water levels were relatively stable over that 30-year period of time. And I'll look to Darek and Jerry here. We see seasonal cycles in most places of the state and most aquifer systems, but they're pretty subdued. It's not as flashy as looking at the Silvies River, very high today, down to 50 or 75 cubic feet per second in August. The aquifer system's a lot more muted response because of just the nature of the recharge and how these flow systems work. The estimates that staff will come up with for how much groundwater can be pumped is going to be based on the best available information we have, which is estimates of what's been pumped and what are the groundwater trends in response to that. And so are we going to be spot on? No, we're not. They're going to be round numbers, but they're going to be pretty close, I think, when all is said and done to what our target flows or amounts are going to be for different decline rates out there. So does that help answer your question?
A little bit, yeah, thank you.
All right, so I want to take us back to this so we can keep powering through. So we just talked about total permissible withdrawal. Another rule that can be made is the disposition of any application for water right permit that was made during the rulemaking process or received prior to that rulemaking process. So essentially what this says is if a water right application comes in during this process, we can make a rule that says how we'll deal with that. Will we review it or will we simply deny it? That's pretty straightforward. And I think that goes along with the first one. I think whatever decision is made on the first one, whether or not we're closing for all further appropriation, we would then disposition those water right applications according to that. Another provision we can make is this is a broad one, any one or more provisions making such additional requirements as are necessary to protect the public welfare, health, and safety. So obviously that's pretty broad reach. So I don't have an example of what we would do here. But as you refer back to the previous criteria, we could deal with groundwater pollution, we could deal with thermal characteristics. And so it may be a case where this is a necessary provision. I don't have an example for how we would use that here currently, unless maybe we were going to use that to curtail some type of exempt well use, but that isn't on the table right now. So the next one is a provision closing all or part of the critical groundwater area to further appropriation of groundwater for its thermal characteristics. So again, we're not looking at thermal characteristics here. And then a provision determining the permissible change in thermal characteristics. So again, these are tools that would be used in specific situations
that don't necessarily line up with what we're dealing with here. So those are the provisions that can be put in rule to curtail use in a critical groundwater area designated critical groundwater area. So if we move on to the next slide, just to recap the current conditions within the Harney Basin study area, groundwater levels are declining or have declined excessively. And within parts of that study area, we've met the definition of overdrawn or about to be overdrawn. And so that's why critical groundwater area designation is going to be part of this rulemaking scope. Next slide. So now let's switch gears and let's talk about a significant water management problem area or serious water management problem area. Justin, which one is it? Serious. Serious. Okay, so I wrote that wrong on the slide. We'll correct it. I apologize for that. So ORS 540-435 gives us authorizes the commission to establish a serious water management problem area where it may be required that any water right owner to install a totalizing measuring device on any surface water or groundwater source. It may require submission of an annual water use report. And then though it authorizes the water master to prohibit water use by anyone who fails to comply. So really this provides accountability for the process, right? So if we set a total permissible withdrawal in the critical groundwater area, we need to be able to hold people accountable to that. And the only way we can do that is to actually track water use. And we need to have everybody have totalizing measuring devices and submit that usage. So any questions on this?
So you kind of confused me there when you went to critical. We're talking serious, I guess. Good. I'm not sure how you're hooking the two together in that last statement you made.
So a serious water management problem area simply allows us to measure water use or to require water use measurements and reporting.
Okay.
And in a critical groundwater area, if we're going to curtail use and try to get to a total permissible withdrawal, right? So a total amount of water use allowed within that area, we have to know how much water is being used each year. Otherwise, there's no accountability. So you could say you're using 3 acre feet, but really you're using 6. And we as the department would have no ability to prove you wrong and hold you to that limit. And so that's how the two would tie together. But they're two separate designations that happen.
Was there rulemaking done for that statute?
The statute is a standalone. There's one serious water management problem area in the state, and that was done several years ago in the Walla Walla subbasin for a salt aquifer system. So this would be about 1 page of rules that's plugged into this rule process. We can share copies of what was written for Walla Walla, but it fundamentally is flow meters are required for wells. These types of flow meters are required or recommended, and you need to read your flow meter once a month and report that water use to the department, mail it in or submit it online once a year.
So you don't use this any place except Walla Walla then?
That's the only place we have a serious water management problem area in the state. The state has existing authority. We can require water measuring device installation on any surface water or groundwater uses, including exempt wells. We do not have the authority to request the data or the reporting to come in. So if we want the data, we have to go out and read the meter. Let's see.
Alexander, we had a question over here first.
So the negative aspect of this is it brings in surface water and groundwater into this, and this rulemaking body is about groundwater. It is almost impossible to accurately measure surface water in a flood management, natural flood and managed floodwater irrigation system. The scientists of experiment station, as an example, are required to do it. They put words in their mouth, but they can't do it in this type of system. So this aspect has tremendous cost potentially on surface water users. And it really muddies the water
in terms of where this serious water management problem is going and how it interrelates surface and groundwater, which is not established by the study that was done. So I just put a caution flag here that this has potential of getting in the way of what some people want. And I'll just give you one little excerpt here. When you have a system like this and you try to artificially restrict the flow like this year when it comes off, you can do a lot of ecological riparian damage by doing that, because Donner Blitz and Sylvies is wonderful examples of natural flood zone. And so incrementally, you could say, okay, we're not going to count the peak flow in water use and those sorts of things, but it gets really confusing and goes down a road that really is not fruitful. And the historical surface water use should be exempt from the requirements of water measurement devices.
So I'll take that one. Tim's just sharing that the statute can require the same on surface water. We have no intention of requiring basin-wide surface water measurement. We measure where we need to in the basin on the Sylvies and Silver Creek, and that's it. So that's not going to be part of it.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Because that'll really put up flags to some people's concerns here. Anyway, thank you.
Absolutely. I'm sorry. The intent here was to just tell you what's allowed, not necessarily what we're going to do. So
I knew that.
absolutely. Yep.
We need to address it.
Alexander, did you have a comment you wanted to make before we?
I'll wait until Chris and Shellman. Mine's more of just a comment for this group.
All right, Kristen?
Just a question, with the swamp being designated, though, it doesn't preclude the department later from going in and doing it, is that correct?
On surface water, that's correct. Yeah, we would just modify it and say now all surface water needs to be measured, or all surface water on Silver Creek. We could do it as surgically or as broadly as needed.
And is there a swamp designation ever removed from a basin?
Well, we've had one for 3 years or 4 years, so far, no. But it could be.
And how would that occur?
We would work with our commission to draft rules to remove the swamp requirement.
They go through the same rulemaking process that we're doing here to create one, to roll it back. The same with modification. We'd have to go through the same rulemaking process in order to modify it. So at the end of the day, the key takeaway is this is what provides accountability for water use and allows us to track water use year over year and to try to reach those targets.
Yeah, just time check is 3:56.
Okay.
Just gotta keep going here, because
All right.
public comment at 4:30.
Well, next slide. I'm almost done, I think. So next slide, this is a duplicate. I was clearly rewriting something and didn't get it all done. Trying to put it in the same format. So then, for classification, this is the third tool we're going to talk about today. So classification is called out in ORS 536-340, and it authorizes the commission to classify the water within a basin as to the highest and best use and quantity of use. So essentially, in this rulemaking process, we can specify the types and quantities of use that will be allowed, and this affects future uses only. So this is the same process that was used to create the GIVGAC, which is in current rule OAR 695-12-0020. And just to point out, this does not affect current uses or users. So any classification that was done would prevent future uses, but does not prevent current uses. So the critical groundwater area designation focuses on current uses and curtailment. Classification focuses on
future uses and specifying what future uses are allowed for water. So any questions on that section?
John Short, on that, does that mean, if an existing water right, if we're gonna transfer to a use that is not classified, is that still allowed?
That is a really good
I
question.
don't know on that.
Yeah,
I think it is, but I'll have to double check. The criteria for transfer is injury and enlargement. And we don't look to other rules of the commission. So you don't look into you wouldn't look at a Division 512 rule when you're evaluating a transfer.
Thank you. Can I ask another quick question? Sir, it's Roger. So a lot of people have been working really hard to convert from MESA to LISA systems already. So is that impacting so you're gonna make some decisions on what you have collected in data, but there's been a lot of changes already in water use by people with changing their irrigation systems. That supposedly could save up to 20% or so. So are your data accurate then, if you're gonna make decisions based upon what you have, when people have been changing it right in the middle?
so we're gonna use the best available data and the best available science to make this decision, because we have to use something. And we will continue to monitor and track water usage, water levels, and adjust our decision making based on that. And that's all we can do.
I just wondered if there was a way to look and see who's converted from MESA to LISA and use that as to adjust the data that you already have. By taking some average percent reduction in use and making it so that they get to, or that the area gets to have a little better accurate portrayal of what's actually going after.
Sure. Yeah, it's good feedback. Steve, you had a comment?
Well, the question more really, and it's how this is applied. So a new business shows up, moving clients. How's that impacted in this? What's worrying to me is we just suddenly have one more state agency that can put a check mark against economic development in this community and outside of farm and ranch.
Steve, this is I guess I'm gonna call it a forward-looking process, for lack of a better word. And we would do a classification in order to stop the bleeding. We don't want more groundwater development in the study area boundary, basically, because it's a one aquifer system, and we've got groundwater level declines that are going down in most areas across that area, variable rates. Some areas are obviously worse than others. So the classification is a way to say, from this point forward, once those rules are adopted, if we classify for exempt uses only, the Water Resources Department will not issue additional water rights in the basin or within that classification boundary, whatever that is. We're done. You can still drill exempt use wells. The existing users aren't harmed. The existing exempt wells get to pump what they're pumping. The existing water righted wells or permitted wells get to continue to pump what they're pumping. We're not looking backwards. We're just looking forwards with the classification scheme. If a business moves into Burns or Hines, they have municipal water rights that they can grow into, and they'll just hook them up and keep serving. So that's fine. But we're not going to see new center pivots of alfalfa coming into the basin or a new industry coming into the basin. One question you need to think about is mining. Precious metals, things like lithium. I'm not aware of any huge deposits in Harney County, but do we want to reserve some groundwater for future activities? We can roll back the classification in the future. Again, it's a rule, it can be changed. There's some national interest where we need to do that. That's something that the commission can take up at a future date. But you know, that's, again, the classification is looking forward. It won't impact existing water rights in any way. Mark?
Another example, Steve, that we've been talking about, and I think we need to go to bat for. So outside of municipality, there's unincorporated communities that might want to put in community well system. Those want to be exempt. So specifically, Crane Community Sewer and Water does not have a water right in order to develop that yet. So when we go through these rules, we got to be insightful enough to think in the future, if community wells or shared water systems is going to be something that we need to go to, making sure we have the ability to do it.
That's why we elect really good people to go to Salem for.
John Short, I'll just add on that for both. As an example, like the Heinz Mill, there's an industrial water right that is on that property that could be used for new uses, as well as there's water rights in and around Crane that could be changed to quasi-municipal or municipal use.
But back to John's earlier question, does this classification system, John, you might answer this now, but does it restrict a change of use through a transfer? Just, I mean, I could see the classification restricting certain things that somebody might want to transfer to a different use. Is that language going to restrict that opportunity? I can't give you a specific example. Steve, I would say.
No, I don't believe it is.
So what will the classification actually restrict, and is that new?
New groundwater rights will not be issued in a classified area.
Thank you.
Or unless there's cutouts or carve outs for specific uses.
Any other questions or comments on this?
So
And one more.
I guess I just want to make sure that we're all aware, like, the last bullet there was, that was the process for the Greater Harmony Valley groundwater area concern, so that is already in place in much of the lower valley area, right? And the communities that's been in place since 2016, so I guess people should have an intuitive feeling for what's happened in the last 7 years, right? Okay. The last 7 years we've been living under a classification area.
All right, any other questions or comments? Okay, so we're gonna kind of get into a section now. So my last email to the RAC members, I asked you to review the old rules and bring forward any suggestions that you want to see changed to the rules. So we're gonna do about a 10-minute conversation. Start the conversation now for about 10 minutes. Of course, we can continue on. You can email me suggestions. We can have conversations outside of the RAC. So this 10 minutes is not the only time we'll reserve for this, but we are under some time restraints. It's 4:30. We got to do a public comment. We have to stick to that. So for let's say for the next 10 minutes or so, does anyone want to bring up like any suggestions that they want to change to the old rules or anything they want to be seen added to the rules? We've heard voluntary agreements.
And we heard classification carve outs from Mark.
Yeah.
John Short. Comes back to, let's use Crane as an example. Actually ran into this with solar, so you have it in some other areas. Is if we're, the vast majority of the water rights are for the irrigation season, which the season cannot be changed in a transfer. So if we're trying to like serve water to a community like Crane, they typically want year-round water, not just during the irrigation season. One way that we've accomplished that in the past was to apply for a new groundwater right that was year-round and voluntarily cancel as something like an irrigation right that had a season limit of the irrigation season. And that would allow getting there. But if that new use is classified, I mean, if
Yeah, you said it correctly. If it's classified, if it's
If it's
classified and
classified,
prevented, yeah.
then that won't ever be an option, is that right?
Correct.
That could be a pain to some cases like industrial coming in that needs it year round, or a community that needs year round water. And that, I didn't see that allowed in this old.
All right.
Go ahead, Mark.
So a couple others, I would also like to see the volunteer agreement process spelled out in rules. How a community or those users in a common aquifer can go to the community. Because there's no rules on it, so I think having some guidelines on how that process is done, like Ben's comment, would be good. Also looking at a monitoring program. So hypothetically, throughout the basin, there'll be areas that are held to a groundwater level. How are we going to determine that? Can the community come together with some sort of monitoring program to identify sentinel wells or other things so that we have a good understanding of water levels? And my understanding will probably be regulated to a water level. The other thing we could probably discuss throughout that is what would be triggers. So if there's sub-basins within the critical groundwater designation, and not all of them are going to go through a contested case process, how does the community know those sub-basins potentially when the next step would happen? So when a contested case could, or areas to water level would go down to this point. So if we're actually drilling domestic wells, we know we need to go to X level because there will be regulatory action taken if water falls below this point. So I think there's a lot of things we should spell out in rules that look foresighting to different areas. But I can give you all this.
Okay, I appreciate that. That's very helpful. Other comments?
So Steve Grassley, so as to make my comments, I want to make sure we're talking about which administrative rules, the ones you sent us an email.
Yeah, the Division 512 rules, correct.
So
yes.
one of the things that I didn't like as I looked through there was terms like reasonably stable. The heck is reasonable? Your idea or mine?
Not defined yet in the state of Washington.
Yeah. No, we agree.
Well, and substantial interference, those were a couple of things.
Nebulous terms.
Yeah, arbitrary. Bob's gonna rule on it one way and Ivan's gonna go the other way. And so, I mean, let's take that out of there if we can as we go forward.
Or maybe define them if we're gonna use them. John?
More towards the solar stuff was an ability to do limited license. Limited licenses, fine if it includes voluntary cancellation or anything, but it seemed like that was an absolutely closed door.
Explain.
Limited licenses are a water use that is only for a certain amount of time, typically less than 5 years. And so something like building a solar project, they need the water for dust control for a year or maybe 2 years. And when we tried to do that, it was because there was no
There was no carve out.
no carve out for it.
Yeah.
Even if we offered a whole bunch of offsetting voluntary cancellation of voluntary non-use.
Right. Gotcha.
We also need to be able to move water around legally so that you're not using more water, you're just being able to combine wells to go to this direction, as opposed to the way it is now. It's done now, it's not legal to pump, I mean, you have a point of appropriation, a point of use, or place of use, and they have to coincide, otherwise legally, you can get your water up to it. So in order to further what we're trying to get done, we'll need to be able to figure out some way to legally move. I mean, go and apply for it, say, I've got 5 pivots and I'd like to be able to use, all 5 wells to run one pit instead of the way it's set up currently now. But each well, we can pit up, that's what you use. Okay. You're still gonna, this comes after you're already measuring your water, so you're not using more water than.
Right.
And could you say your name for people?
Ken Benz.
Thank you.
Good, Roger. I just, throughout the whole discussion, one of the things that's not clear to me is, and especially when we're talking about rules, is when the junior, senior water right program is being implemented, the equal use processes that give senior water right holders their or junior, it's never clear to me when that becomes something that could be triggered. I don't know what other people think about it, but for me, it seems like all the way through any of these decision-making processes, ideally, you'd like to make it so everybody has the water that they need. I see that in what you're trying to set up with these 3 different different tools. Yeah, tools. But I never see, or I rarely ever saw much discussion about the role that the primary law that I've understood to be prevalent, where it actually plays a part in each of these.
And so you're talking about the system of prior appropriation. So
Yeah.
when would
so-
a senior get water and a junior would be curtailed?
Well, or if you're gonna have people do something, and you say, okay, now everybody has to do it, is that true? Or should we have the juniors do it? And that, if you get what I'm saying, I mean, I just don't know when you would apply this senior, junior.
The priority dates.
Yeah.
Roger, it raises some good questions, and I think the group and the community will have to wrestle with different alternatives. I'd like you all to go away thinking about the question as a boundary within this area, whatever you want to define the area. Do you agree that groundwater use has to slow down? I mean, that's the agency's perspective is, yes, it does. So that's where we want to bring the community to, is hopefully getting some broad agreement that that's really something that needs to happen. How we get there, there's lots of different paths and roads and timelines, I think, that we can explore together. The historical way, the state of Oregon, this is not the first critical groundwater area. We have, 6 other critical groundwater areas in the state. The first one was Little Cow Valley over in Malheur County, in the mid-50s, I think. But shoot, I lost my train of thought. The historical way of dealing with it, some critical areas just stopped development, a little bit like classification. Others, primarily in the salt aquifer system in the Umatilla Basin, did the curtailment. In some sub areas, there were up to 90% curtailment that occurred. So 9 out of 10 acres went dry in order to slow down the rate of decline. It's still going down.
And
we did that
by
based
priority too.
We did that strictly based on priority. Looked at the prior appropriation and came up with the senior users. There's enough water for these guys, and there's a little bit of room for some folks to share, if you will, amongst those. But it was a pretty black and white exercise. How much do we think is available, and allocated all to the seniors, and the juniors are just dried up. That's an option. And probably in a complete vacuum, that's what the department would go towards, because we wouldn't have any other voluntary approaches that are out there. So I really encourage everybody to think about alternatives to that, and what you want your community to look like, what you want your sub area to look like. And as farmers and business people, you're running businesses. How do you stay in business with less water? In some cases, potentially a lot less. How do you balance all that out with the different tools that are available? And again, there's the CREP program. There's other things that can help. But
that's really, I think, the tough exercise.
I appreciate that thinking. I mean, it gives people a chance to try to solve some problems before people actually get forced to not use water. So, yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, when the boundaries drawn around a specific area, you're going to have areas in the center of the problem area that have significantly different drawdowns than a big part of certain areas. In other words, you might have sustainable levels, in a certain area, it's got a line around it of 1 foot over many years. And then you've got 5 to 10, 15 feet lost in the other areas. So I think we need to, because if there's not language in there giving a little bit of flexibility to manage the water through monitoring, it's going to cause a number of legal problems when you have a small area. It might not be, it might be partially tied to the area, it might be tied to another small aquifer that really is kind of already meeting the sustainable criteria. So I'm sure there'll be other people that have ideas on how to do that, but I think it's a critical thing to look at in the rule. The other thing that might or might not be part of it is we have a number of illegally on modern standards of well construction. And I do not want a rule that restricts irrigators from having a positive incentive to abandon and reconstruct. And right now, the part of the rule is you're kind of forced, it's my understanding, not knowledgeable, but you have to reconstruct the exact well when in reality that might be good to abandon that well, move 10 feet over. Those type of things cross into this rule. I'm not sure where, Ivan or Tim, but we need, that's just two things. We need to recognize that we want a positive encouragement to do what's right on a number of these things. And I want that built into the rule where we can. So I'd like to have that open as a part of the discussion in the next 4 lines.
Okay, absolutely, got that.
I want to bring up recharge areas.
That was
Obviously, recharge areas are few and far between within this basin. There's really not that many. And what I've seen in the last little bit is that the department is legally allowed wells to be drilled and pumpage to begin to occur in our major recharge areas of basin. Obviously, it was done by permit that was already applied for, that went through. But when we look at ideas of curtailment, is there any way to prioritize some of our recharge areas potentially to curtail some of the water use in there? Because now you're sucking up your recharge instead of reaching the system. You're now allowing it to just get pumped out for a duration, where prior to that in those same areas within the last 10 years, you're now starting to see another hole popped here and another hole popped there. And so any amount of recharge that we did have going on is now no longer benefiting us the same way as it was prior to irrigation start being developed within the recharge area.
Thank you. I've added that.
And the other thing I want to bring up that follows that is artificial recharge areas. That's a critical part, in my view, of this rule and the community monitoring or whatever language we add to it. There are actually natural recharge areas that could be enhanced to a greater degree. There's also artificial recharge areas that could be developed, substantial ones. So we need a rule that provides for that and provides change for that. Because if you have an area that's got a certain decline and everybody got together and constructed a legal artificial recharge area, you need to have a system that adapts to that change that is going to change the water budget in a sub area or even broader.
Great. Thanks, brother.
We started this, so I'm gonna switch slides, we're doing questions and comments. So we have about 7 more minutes and then need to open up to the public, so any last minute questions, comments from the RAC members? But then Ken, I see that you have a lot of questions online, Ken,
I got one.
Sure.
So there's already a series of rules as far as surface water and the junior water rights and the senior water rights, correct? As how much water goes into the valley where it goes compared to the junior and the senior water rights. Isn't that already in place?
Well, there's a lot of surface, there's a lot of water use.
Water's already
It's adjudicated and there's surface water rights, so we measure how much comes in. You know, we have to be careful about enhancing recharge. There are folks with 1860s era surface water rights here, so we can't take surface water from them unless we have surplus, basically. But yeah, so there's a surface water system of water rights and distribution and aging stations to measure that.
And so what I'm hearing is when they start actually metering how much water is being taken out, then that's where you're gonna come up with the question as far as senior water rights, right?
I don't know that I'm following your question. What we're talking about doing is getting flow meters on all permitted groundwater wells in
Right.
whatever the
Figure out
swamp
what's
is.
there, right?
Yeah, so we can figure out how much is pumped. And then, you know, what's consumed, we can look at that with the satellite imagery, and there's a difference there. And that's pretty much it. That measurement of the groundwater use doesn't have anything to do with whether they're a junior water right holder or a senior water right holder.
But I'm telling you, give you a like a surface water, when they give you like data through where the senior water right can pump more than the junior water right.
Some of that data is, in a rough sense, is in the water right itself. You know, you can have a very senior water right that's for 10 acres only. And it may be the most senior, but it's only for 10 acres. And the most junior might be for 10,000 acres. So we've got that scattered throughout the senior junior priority system. Groundwater rights of various priority dates and various sizes, if you will, or volumes. But the flow meters will tell us what's actually pumped for each well or for each water right, and there's lots of complications there. There is one well with multiple water rights on it. There might be multiple water rights covered by one well. So we have to tease all of that data apart.
But there are rules gauging that particular.
There's not really rules. I guess it's just best practices with how we measure water use and regulate water use. Our water masters, Dally and Jason and I, we deal in the world of our, what we call Division 250 rules. Those are sort of the duties of a water master. How do we do regulation and distribution? How do we handle complaints, things like that.
Any other comments or questions from the RAC?
All right, I am gonna go ahead then, it's 4:27, I'm gonna open up the meeting to the public now. We're gonna, so how it's gonna work is first we're gonna start with Ken here because you've been asking all the questions, so Ken, if you wanna unmute yourself and start, you can ask those questions, we can answer them, or I can read the questions, however you wanna do it.
I think there's a couple of fundamental questions. One is, I think it would be useful to consider the options on the boundaries, different boundaries for the designation of a critical groundwater management area. And secondarily, the question of whether a SWAMPA would have to cover the entire critical groundwater management area or not. It could be a separate area, and trying to look at, it would be wise, in my opinion, to present the RAC with choices and display different choices that you might have that could be used for management, because these are management boundaries. And while they're defined by the best available science, they're also tools for managing groundwater use. So that's really a suggestion for consideration by the department. The second question, two questions I have. One is, when will the groundwater model be available publicly so it can be used to look at what some options might be and the implication of those options? And then the third comment I have that I think is, if the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program is to be effective, there has to be some tool made available for limited licenses to irrigate in the interim while a permanent cover is established. So those are just the comments that I would have. And I think there's value in not presenting the RAC with a single approach, but giving them options so that they can use their judgment, because they're using the water, on how it might fit the community. Thank you.
It's GS practice not to release the model until the report is peer reviewed and public.
Yeah, yes, that's. I will be bearer of bad news. The USGS model done, but in the peer review process, as the folks involved in the phase 1 of the study know painfully that is a long process, and that might very well be longer than the RAC process.
Does the department have access to the model, and can they run scenarios?
My understanding is not.
Has the model been validated?
The model has been calibrated and is in peer review right now, so it what you mean by validated is peer review, that's occurring right now.
An accuracy assessment?
That's been completed.
If that's just, is that you, Justin? If you could speak up a little bit, it's a little hard to hear.
That's Justin.
So just John Short. So Justin, you're saying we may well need to make huge decisions before having the model available to use to predict the outcomes.
We will make decisions, not they, we will.
Yeah, I don't, the model is going to be a really useful tool, but again, there's some standards and practices of hydrogeology that are going to help us with that. If we have a 10-foot decline rate and we cut our pumping by 50%, that decline rate starts to look more like 5 feet per year. So we can start with some rough estimates of where we're going to be heading and not need a model to tell us those.
Is there
So
anybody?
the other question would be then, when will the estimates of that Jerry is going to be working on for sustainable use for different areas, when will those areas be defined, and when will that information be available?
We intend to put that into a report that we'll present to the commission, or we'll have available to present to the commission, and we will present it to this RAC at RAC number 2 is the intent.
The late summer, basically.
So August, late August is, yeah, would be the next RAC meeting. So hopefully we have it done by early August, so you would all have time to review.
So it'd be for my birthday. Thank you.
I don't know when your birthday is, but yeah.
August 25th.
All
Happy
right.
birthday, Ken.
So is there anyone else online that wishes to make a public comment? Okay, anyone in the room wish to make a comment, please, can you say your name?
So Jack Carges, I just want to kind of add to what Ken was just talking about. So Ken described the scenario where the department would provide alternatives for the RAC. Kind of pick and choose from, maybe instead of just providing an alternative, you're picking and choosing, you provide strong man alternatives, so the RAC actually has an opportunity to find meaningful input and change to those alternatives. The second thing I have is the classification system that you guys are talking about. Is the objective of that system to reduce water use?
No,
What is the objective?
the objective is to stop future development of the groundwater resource
Future development. But does that
with,
mean-
with water rights. So it doesn't impact new exempt wells coming in.
Okay, but does that mean you're trying to make sure you don't add any additional groundwater use in the future? Is that what you're doing?
Large part, yes.
Okay, so if that's the objective, in the process, is it possible to kind of redefine? Because it's impossible to identify right now today what we need years from now. And so instead of trying to list all these things that we think we're not part, is it possible to just do a blanket type of approach to it where you say, okay, we don't know what those uses are going to be, but if there is a new use, it has to be subtracted from the existing water use. Does that make sense?
Basically offset by.
Or an offset, another way to say it. So you're not using additional water, which means meeting the objective of the classification process, but at the same time, gives you flexibility to adapt to change.
Yeah, let's talk more about that, because when you say that, in my mind, I jump for a water right transfer process, which a number of you have touched on, Fred did, John did. That needs modernization as well. We want maximum flexibility, but we don't want to be forced into doing something dumb with the transfer. And right now, there are loopholes in our transfer process that force the agency to do things that we would not do. And so that's a whole nother rule process, and we can't fix transfers. We can't provide more flexibility for transfers in this rule process. That's going to have to be something that's in a different rule. But Chad, let's talk more about that, because I'd be curious are you thinking about like setting aside a volume of water for future development for high needs for the community, or more of somebody mentioned an offset or a mitigation approach where we would cancel that groundwater right over there for irrigation, and now we could take that volume of water and use it for a new use? Yeah, okay.
Is there any other public comment in the room?
So is it a possibility that in the rulemaking, there could be some definition of evaluation of whether this is working, like at certain periods, like 5 years, 10 years? Because if you put all these rules in place and it's either not at all addressing the situation, or maybe it's overachieving, if we're lucky, then there may be opportunities to reevaluate how you move forward from that. And it seems like a lot of these rules are like so stiff and inflexible that if you can build some evaluation time frame into it, it helps to really make decisions in a more educated way.
That's a great question, and Mark touched on it earlier with kind of a concept of sentinel wells. We're trying to figure out internally what path do we have that we could build that into the system and make it easily understood, easy to manage, and legally defensible. And the legally defensible part is kind of the challenging one there. We can certainly in rule lay out, say, target groundwater elevations for a sub area or for a specific well in a sub area. And that kind of gets hardwired in there. We're just the management tools, though. If everything is done voluntarily outside of that second step of the critical groundwater area process, then that would work really well. Here's our target. You guys start reducing water use. We want the rate of decline reduced to X in 5 years or 10 years. And you never ever drop water levels below this point at these 3 wells in this particular area. If we can get there without having to get to step 2 of the critical groundwater area process, that's a huge win for everybody involved. If we have to go to step 2 of the critical groundwater area process, we're now very focused on, maybe it's strict priority, the junior priority dates, and they get curtailed off. And that's the end of that contested case hearing process. And so if we miss our target and water levels are still declining too fast, or we go below the level on a Sentinel well, we have to re-engage and start another contested case process with another group of junior groundwater users and begin that whole process over again. And that's going to take several years for that contested case process to move forward. So it's not a very adept or adaptable management system. That's what we're talking about internally, is seeing if there's some other mechanism we can come up with that would work.
Can you say your name just for the record?
Yeah, I'm Jerry, you know, I just, if the public knows, will know who's on the RAC, because they might want to make some suggestions.
Yeah, so the roster is actually posted on our website, so it is public, information, yes. And I can share that with you, I can give you email, I can share that.
I think it's a good part of that statement.
Yes, okay. Any other public comments online or in the room? Okay. Well, if there's any comments that you can always email me or give me a call, I'm available to communicate. So we're gonna go ahead and wrap this process up today. So our next RAC is gonna be August 29th, location. It's probably gonna be here in this room. It's gonna be from 1 to 5. Our expected topics is gonna be, we're gonna remove outdated language, talk about the city's water management planning area, and then critical groundwater area roles. So thank you so much. We appreciate all your time.
Yes, thank you all for coming, for your open and honest feedback.
Yeah.